It was one of those quiet evenings when the world outside feels like it's holding its breath. Rain tapped softly against the glass, the street lamp spilling a dull orange glow across the empty road. I was just sitting there, half lost in thought, when my eyes drifted to the window across the street. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, I saw her, Mrs. Kellen, moving quickly, almost frantically, inside her dimly lit living room. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she kept glancing toward the door like she was expecting someone, or hiding from them. I leaned in, my curiosity pulling me closer, and for a moment her eyes met mine. She froze. Then she walked straight to her own window, pulled the curtain shut with a sudden snap, and through the thin glass I heard her voice, low and sharp, almost trembling. "You didn't see anything, right?" And just like that, she was gone, leaving me with a silence that felt heavier than the rain outside. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, a steady, unbroken rhythm against the roof, the kind of sound that could lull you into a trance if you let it. The streets outside were washed in that murky glow you only get from old street lamps, their light bending through the curtain of water. I had the television on, but I wasn't really watching, just letting the voices fade into background noise. My thoughts wandered in that lazy, aimless way they do on slow nights. I remember looking at the clock, 8:47 p.m., and feeling that strange sense of stillness in the air, as if something was waiting to happen. My gaze drifted toward the window, not because I was expecting anything, but because movement caught my eye. Across the street, in the house opposite mine, there was a thin crack between the curtains, just enough for me to see inside. That's when I saw her, Mrs. Kellen. She wasn't just standing still like someone looking for their keys or reaching for a drink. No, she was moving with a kind of urgency I'd never seen in her before. Her hands were trembling as she picked something up from the coffee table, something small, shiny, maybe metallic, and then set it down again. She kept turning toward the door, then back to whatever she was doing, her breathing quick enough that I could see her shoulders rise and fall. I knew her, at least in the way neighbors know each other, polite nods on the sidewalk, a few short conversations about the weather, the kind of surface familiarity that doesn't go much deeper. But in that moment, I felt like I was seeing her for the first time, and there was something unsettling in her expression. Her face was pale, almost drained of color, and her eyes, God, her eyes, looked like they were carrying the weight of something she couldn't put down. I leaned forward, drawn in by a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't name. Maybe it was concern. Maybe it was just that I'd never seen her like this. The gap in her curtains was narrow, and I had to tilt my head slightly to keep her in view. That's when she stopped moving. She turned her head sharply, like she had heard something, or maybe sensed it. And then, to my shock, her gaze locked directly on mine. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other through that small opening. My pulse quickened, the sound of the rain suddenly louder, like it was closing us in. Then she did something I will never forget. She walked straight toward the window with slow, deliberate steps. My breath caught as she reached for the curtain, her eyes never leaving mine. In one swift motion, she pulled it shut, the fabric snapping together so hard it seemed to shake the rod above. The room on her side went dark, but in that instant before the curtain fully closed, her lips moved. I heard it, not clearly, but enough to know the words. "You didn't see anything, right?" The sound carried faintly through the glass, muffled by the rain, but the tone in her voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a question. It was a warning, and the kind that sinks deep into your chest before your mind can make sense of it. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, my hand resting against the window frame. I didn't know what to think, didn't know what I had just been a part of. It would have been easy to dismiss it as nothing, to tell myself I misheard her, that I was imagining the tension in her voice. But something in the way she looked at me made that impossible. Even after I stepped away, the image stayed in my head, her pale face, the fear in her eyes, the sharp sound of the curtain sliding shut. I sat back down on the couch, but the TV's noise seemed hollow now, like it belonged to some other place entirely. My attention kept drifting back to the rain-smeared glass, as though I expected her to appear again. Minutes passed. The house felt colder, the shadows longer. I found myself listening, not just to the rain, but for anything else. A sound outside. A knock on the door. Footsteps on the porch. But nothing came. Only the steady tapping of water against the glass, and the lingering echo of her voice in my head. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment again, her gaze meeting mine, her lips moving with those words, the curtain sealing her away. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning. The first crack in the surface of an ordinary life. The first sign that something was wrong. And it would stay with me, growing heavier with each passing day, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning should have felt normal, but it didn't. Even the light coming through my window seemed dimmer, like the world had been muted overnight. I kept replaying that moment in my mind, her voice threading through my thoughts no matter what I tried to focus on. At breakfast, I found myself staring into my coffee, the steam curling up in lazy spirals, and all I could see was her pale face framed by the narrow gap in those curtains. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Neighbors have private moments all the time. Maybe she was embarrassed I saw her upset. Maybe it had nothing to do with me. But those explanations felt too neat, too small to fit the weight of her expression. By mid-afternoon, the unease had settled into my chest like a stone. I decided to walk to the corner store just to get out of the house, hoping the fresh air might shake me loose from it. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still slick, the air smelling faintly of damp leaves and asphalt. As I passed her house, I slowed just a little. Her curtains were drawn tight, both upstairs and down, like she was trying to seal herself off from the world. On the porch, her welcome mat was crooked, one corner bent upward as if someone had stepped on it in a hurry. It was such a small thing, but for some reason it caught my attention, like a tiny piece of a bigger picture I couldn't see yet. I made myself keep walking. At the store, the bright fluorescent lights and hum of the refrigerators felt strangely jarring after the quiet street outside. I grabbed milk, bread, and a newspaper without really thinking. The headlines were the usual mess: politics, sports scores, a crime story from 2 towns over. Nothing about her. On my way back, the neighborhood was still. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. When I reached her place again, I caught myself glancing toward the side of the house, where a narrow alley ran between her property and the next. That's when I noticed it, dark, irregular stains near the base of the fence. They were fresh enough to stand out against the damp wood, and though the rain might have washed them partially away, they still carried a deep reddish-brown tint. I told myself it was probably nothing more than paint or rust, but the thought didn't sit right. My pace quickened without me meaning it to. That night, I tried to keep busy, washed dishes, read a few chapters of a book I'd been meaning to finish, let the TV fill the silence again, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. It wasn't even that I expected to see her, it was more that I felt like I might. Around 9, curiosity finally got the better of me. I went to the front of the house, careful not to turn on too many lights, and looked out through my own curtains. Across the street, in the dim glow spilling from her dining room, she was there. Not moving. Just sitting at the table, her hands resting on the wood, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. There was no plate, no cup, nothing to suggest she'd been eating or drinking. It was like she had been frozen there for hours. She didn't look toward the window this time, didn't acknowledge me at all. But there was something about her stillness that made my skin crawl, as if whatever she was staring at was worse than anything outside. I stepped back, letting the curtain fall into place, but the image of her sitting alone stayed with me. Lying in bed later, I thought about walking over there, about knocking on her door and asking if she was okay. But even in my imagination, that idea collapsed into silence. What would I say? That I'd been watching her? That I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd shut her curtains on me? No, there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound strange. Still, my chest felt heavy with the thought that I was ignoring something important. The house was too quiet, my own breathing loud in the stillness. I told myself again and again to let it go, to mind my own business, to stop making something out of nothing. But under that self-reassurance, a deeper truth stirred, one I didn't want to face yet. Whatever had happened in that room across the street, it hadn't ended when she closed the curtain. It had only just begun. By the third day, I had stopped pretending to myself that what I saw was nothing. It had started to settle in the way certain memories do, not as a single moment, but as a shadow that follows you no matter where you turn. Every time I glanced out the window, my eyes landed on her house almost involuntarily, scanning for movement, for some sign of life. Sometimes the curtains would twitch, just slightly, as if touched from the inside. Other times the place looked entirely deserted. I began to remember little things about her, pieces of conversations from months or even years before. Mrs. Kellen had moved here with her husband about 5 years ago. Back then, they seemed like the kind of couple that kept to themselves but got along well enough with the neighbors, polite smiles, the occasional small talk over hedges. Then, 2 years ago, he disappeared. The official story was that he'd gone to visit relatives and never came back, but whispers in the neighborhood said otherwise. Some claimed he'd run off with another woman. Others said he had debts, serious ones. One man at the hardware store swore he'd heard shouting in their house the night before he vanished. I'd never paid much attention to gossip like that. People can make monsters out of anyone when they're bored. But now those fragments started to arrange themselves into a picture I couldn't quite bring into focus. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd noticed odd things about her before: delivery trucks pulling up late at night, packages left on her porch that she took inside quickly and without a word, strangers coming and going through the alley at the side of her house. It had always been easy to shrug off. Not anymore. That evening, unable to help myself, I decided to take a walk past her house after dark. The air was heavy and cool, the kind that makes you feel every sound is sharper. As I passed by, I caught it, a muffled sound coming from inside, like someone crying softly. I slowed my pace, my ears straining. The sobs were faint but steady, and every so often I heard another noise beneath them, a metallic clink, rhythmic, deliberate. My mind ran through possibilities: cutlery on a plate, keys against a table, but none of them felt right. This was heavier, more solid, like the sound of something being locked away or secured. I hesitated near the sidewalk, my eyes fixed on the narrow line of light that leaked between her curtains. The crying stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence so complete I could hear my own breathing. That's when it happened: quick, light footsteps on the pavement behind me. My spine tightened instantly. I turned, but the street was empty. The footsteps had been there, I was certain, but now there was only the dim glow of the streetlights on wet asphalt and the distant hiss of tires from the main road. I started walking again, faster this time, glancing over my shoulder more than once. When I reached my own house, I locked the door and stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing. No one at the window across the street. No movement in the shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted that night. It wasn't just her anymore. Whatever this was, I was in it now too, whether I wanted to be or not. The next few days bled together in a haze of unease. I tried to carry on as normal, work, errands, small conversations with people who had no idea how distracted I was, but the sense of being watched never left me. It wasn't constant, not exactly, more like it would wash over me in waves. I would be halfway through making coffee or folding laundry when I'd suddenly be certain that eyes were on me, studying me from somewhere just out of sight. I started noticing small, unsettling details inside my own home. A chair in the dining room pulled a few inches away from the table when I was sure I'd pushed it in. A book lying open on the couch, even though I hadn't touched it in days. At first, I told myself I was being careless, forgetful. But the more it happened, the harder it became to believe that. The feeling in my stomach told me something else entirely, that someone had been here. That someone might still be coming in when I wasn't around. Sleep was the hardest part. At night, every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow made my pulse quicken. I kept my bedroom door closed, but I would lie there staring at it, wondering what I would do if it opened. My dreams, when they came, were restless and fragmented. I saw flashes of Mrs. Kellen's face, pale and tense, her lips moving with those words again, "You didn't see anything, right?" The sound of fabric snapping shut, the rustle of curtains, always came before I woke with my heart racing. Finally, after almost a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to speak to her. Maybe I'd been overthinking everything. Maybe she would laugh it off, tell me there was a simple explanation, and I could let this whole thing go. The air was cold when I stepped outside, the kind of chill that stings your nose. I crossed the street slowly, glancing around more than I wanted to admit. When I reached her porch, I hesitated for a moment before knocking. The sound echoed slightly, too loud in the stillness. A few seconds later, the door opened just far enough for her to stand in the gap. She looked different in the daylight, but not in a way that made me feel any better. Her hair was pulled back loosely, and her eyes seemed sharper, more guarded. There was no smile, no polite neighborly greeting. Behind her, the faint but unmistakable smell of bleach drifted out. It was so strong it stung the back of my throat. My mouth went dry. "I just wanted to check in," I said, my voice coming out softer than I'd intended. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze stayed locked on mine for several long seconds, so long I almost looked away. Then she leaned in just slightly, her voice low and even. "If anyone asks, you don't know me." The words hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I could feel the questions piling up behind my teeth, but she was already pulling the door closed. The latch clicked into place, and I was left standing there with the cold wind on my face and that chemical smell still burning my nose. I walked back across the street slowly, the world around me feeling oddly distant, as though everything was a step removed from reality. Inside my house, I locked the door and stood still, listening to my own breathing. That was the moment I knew, this wasn't just about what I'd seen anymore. Whatever she was caught up in, it had reached across the street and touched me, and now there was no going back. It was the conversation at the corner store that turned my unease into something darker, heavier. I had gone there late in the afternoon, partly because I needed a few things, partly because I couldn't stand sitting in my house any longer, pacing between the window and the couch. The bell above the door jingled when I walked in, and as always, the place smelled faintly of old wood and coffee that had been sitting in the pot for hours. I picked up a carton of milk, some bread, and was debating whether to grab a pack of tea when I heard two voices near the shelves by the back. They belonged to Mr. Harris and Mrs. Lang, both of whom had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had the kind of memory that kept every story alive long past the time it should have faded. They didn't see me at first, and I froze when I heard Mrs. Lang say, "They found a body out near the highway. Male, mid-40s, maybe older. The police have been sniffing around." Mr. Harris lowered his voice, but I still caught the next part. "If you ask me, they ought to be looking right here. Should have done it years ago." There was a pause, the faint sound of paper crinkling as he shifted his bag. "You know who I mean," he added. "That woman in the Kellen house. Mark my words, nothing good has ever come from there since her husband vanished." I stood completely still, the air in my lungs suddenly feeling too thin. Mrs. Lang gave a soft, almost pitying laugh. "Poor thing," she said, though it didn't sound entirely sincere. "Poor thing, maybe. But I wouldn't trust her as far as I could throw her," he replied. I backed away quietly, making sure my footsteps didn't echo on the worn linoleum. By the time I paid for my things and stepped outside, the sun had dipped low, casting the street in long shadows. The air felt colder than it had when I left the house, though that could have been my own nerves crawling under my skin. I walked home slowly, my mind turning over what I'd heard. A body. The police. And her name, well, not her name exactly, but close enough, right there in their conversation. That night, I didn't even pretend I wasn't watching her house. I sat in the dark by my own window, the curtains drawn just enough to give me a narrow view of her front porch. Hours passed like that, the street quiet except for the occasional car gliding past. It was close to midnight when I saw her. She stepped out onto the porch carrying a small suitcase, the kind you could fit under an airplane seat. She was dressed in a dark coat, her hair tucked up under a scarf, and she moved quickly, glancing up and down the street before locking her door. My pulse spiked as she started walking toward the corner, her pace brisk but not hurried enough to draw attention. Without really deciding to, I found myself slipping on my shoes, grabbing my keys, and stepping into the night. I stayed far enough behind her that the sound of my footsteps blended into the hum of distant traffic. She didn't look back, not once, but her head kept tilting slightly as if she were listening for something. After a few blocks, she stopped in front of a rundown motel with flickering neon in the window. I watched her disappear inside, the door swinging shut behind her. I lingered across the street, torn between going closer and walking away. I was about to leave when another figure emerged from the shadows near the alley beside the motel. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat that seemed to swallow the light. He moved with quiet confidence, his steps measured, purposeful. Without hesitation, he followed her inside. Something about the way he moved made the hair on my arms stand on end, not fast, not frantic, just certain, like a predator closing in on prey. I stood there for a long time after the door closed, the neon buzzing faintly above the street, my breath clouding in the cold air. I didn't know why she had gone there, or who that man was, but one thing was certain, whatever I had stumbled into, it was far from over, and I was in far deeper than I had ever meant to be. I didn't sleep at all that night. Even after I got back home from the motel, I sat in the dark on my couch, staring at nothing, my mind spinning in 100 directions. The image of her walking into that rundown building was bad enough, but it was the man who followed her that really dug under my skin. Something about his presence, the way he moved, the stillness in his steps, made it clear he wasn't there by accident. I kept thinking about whether they knew each other, whether she had been expecting him, or whether she had walked straight into something she couldn't get out of. By the time dawn started bleeding into the sky, my body ached with exhaustion, but my mind was too wired to rest. I told myself to leave it alone, to stop chasing shadows, but as soon as the sun was up, I found myself pulling on my jacket and heading back to that motel. The streets were quiet, the air sharp with the smell of early morning dew. When I got there, the neon sign was off, the front desk unattended, just a faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. I walked past slowly, my eyes scanning the row of doors. I stopped in front of the one she had gone into the night before. It was closed, locked, and when I leaned close to listen, there was no sound from inside, not even the faint hum of a television. I checked the window. The curtains were drawn tight, but I could see just enough of the inside to tell the bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept there at all. The carpet looked untouched. My stomach tightened. She had checked in, but she hadn't stayed. I went inside to the front desk, where a thin man with tired eyes finally appeared from a back room. I asked casually if a woman fitting her description had rented a room. He shook his head without hesitation. "No one like that," he said flatly, his gaze sliding past me like he wanted me gone. There was no point pressing him, it was clear I wasn't going to get anything. I walked away with the uneasy certainty that he was lying. Back at home, I was trying to convince myself to forget it all when I noticed something on the floor just inside my front door. An envelope. No stamp, no address, just plain white paper folded neatly. My name wasn't on it. I bent down, my fingers hesitant, and picked it up. The weight of it felt wrong, too light, too empty. Inside was a single photograph. I froze the moment I saw it. It was her, Mrs. Kellen, standing in her kitchen. The picture was taken from outside her house, the angle tilted just enough that it looked like it had been shot through the very window I'd looked through days ago. She was staring directly at the camera, her face expressionless, her eyes dark and unreadable. The curtains behind her were wide open. My hands began to sweat as I flipped it over. On the back, in messy, uneven handwriting, were 2 words, "Stop looking." The letters seemed to press into the paper, like whoever had written them had done so with a heavy, almost violent hand. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at those words, the meaning sinking into me like ice. Someone knew I had been watching her. Someone knew I'd been to the motel. And they wanted me to back off. I stood there for a long time, the photograph trembling in my grip, the quiet of my house pressing in on me from all sides. I wanted to throw it away, burn it, erase it from existence, but I couldn't. I set it down on the table and just stared at it, feeling the weight of a truth I didn't want to accept. I wasn't just observing this anymore. I was inside it now. And there was no telling who else knew. For the next 2 days, I barely left the house. I told myself it was because of work, because I had things to do, but deep down I knew it was fear keeping me inside. The photograph stayed on my kitchen table, face down, but I could feel it there every time I passed by. The words on the back were burned into my mind, each letter carrying the same cold finality as a locked door. I started locking everything, the front door, the back door, even the small window in the laundry room that no one ever used. I checked them twice, sometimes 3 times, before I went to bed. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. I'd catch myself glancing toward the corners of rooms, half expecting to see a shadow shift, or to hear the faint creak of someone moving just out of sight. Sleep became impossible. Every sound seemed amplified in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock on the wall, the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards settling under the weight of the house. My mind played tricks on me. More than once I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, only to find the space empty when I got up to check. On the 3rd night, the rain returned, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the windows and pooling in the gutters outside. I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring at the dark reflection of my own face in the glass. That was when I heard it, a knock at the front door. Not loud, not urgent, but firm. My body tensed, and for a long moment I didn't move, hoping maybe I'd imagined it. Then it came again, slightly louder this time. Slowly, I stood and made my way to the door, my steps almost soundless on the carpet. I peered through the peephole and froze. She was standing there. Mrs. Callan. Her coat was soaked through, her hair plastered to her head by the rain, her skin pale under the dim porch light. But her eyes looked different. Not just fearful, resigned, as though she had finally reached the edge of something she had been running from. I hesitated, every warning bell in my head telling me not to open the door, but my hand turned the lock anyway. She stepped inside without waiting for me to invite her, closing the door quickly behind her and twisting the lock. Then she went to each window in the living room, yanking the curtains shut with a practiced efficiency, as if she'd done it 100 times before. The smell of wet fabric clung to her, mixing with the faint scent of something metallic, blood, or maybe just rust. When she finally stopped moving, she turned to me and spoke in a voice that was low but steady. "It's not safe for me anymore, and it's not safe for you." My mouth opened, but no words came out. The questions in my head tangled together, none of them able to make it past my lips. She didn't wait for me to respond. Her eyes flicked toward the front window, and I followed her gaze just in time to see headlights sweep across the wall. A car had pulled up outside, the engine idling low and steady. The shape of it was barely visible through the curtain, but I could hear the quiet thud of a door opening, followed by the crunch of footsteps on wet pavement. The sound was deliberate, unhurried. My heart pounded in my ears as I looked at her, but she only raised a finger to her lips, a silent command for me to stay quiet. In that moment, I realized something: whatever was out there wasn't just looking for her anymore. It had found me too. The sound of those footsteps outside seemed to stretch time itself. Each one landed with a slow, heavy certainty, the kind that told you whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry because they didn't have to be. The car engine kept running, a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet of the house. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my eyes locked on the curtains, my breath shallow. Beside me, Mrs. Callan didn't move either. She was still, but her stillness wasn't fear, it was calculation, like she was listening for something in between the sounds, some cue only she would recognize. Then, without looking at me, she whispered, "They won't come in if they think you're not here." The words didn't make sense, but I didn't have time to question them. The footsteps stopped just short of the porch. Silence followed, long enough to make my pulse race faster, my skin prickling with the tension of waiting for the knock that never came. Instead, after what felt like minutes, there was the sound of the car door opening again. A brief pause, then it slammed shut. The engine's rumble grew quieter as it rolled away into the rain-soaked street until finally, there was nothing but the steady patter of water against the windows. I turned to her, ready to demand an explanation, but her expression stopped me. There was no relief in her face, no sign that the danger had passed, only the kind of weariness you see in people who've been running for a very long time. She sank into the couch as though her body had been holding itself upright for too many hours. "I can't stay here," she said, her voice low. "They found me sooner than I thought they would." I sat across from her, my hands gripping my knees. Who are they? And what do they want?" She looked down at her hands before answering. "Years ago, before I moved here, there was an accident." That's what I told myself at first. But it wasn't. It was a choice I made. And it cost someone their life. People don't forget things like that, especially not the kind of people I was dealing with. Her voice cracked on the last words, but she kept going. She told me about her husband, how he had tried to help her cover it up, how they thought they'd left it all behind. But the debts, the lies, the threats, they followed them. He had disappeared not because he wanted to leave her, but because they had given him a choice, vanish or die. She never knew which one he picked, only that he was gone. She had been hiding ever since, moving from one place to another, staying just long enough to feel almost safe before it started all over again. "When you saw me at the window that night," she said, meeting my eyes for the first time in the conversation, "I had just gotten word they were close again. I was packing, trying to decide if I could get out in time. But you were watching, Anne." I panicked. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to take her story at face value, but another part wondered how much she was leaving out. She didn't ask me for help, didn't tell me where she would go next. She only stood, pulled her coat tighter around her, and said, "Don't tell anyone I was here. Don't even tell yourself, if you can help it. The less you know, the safer you are." And then she was gone, slipping out the back door into the rain without looking back. I went to the window and watched as her figure disappeared into the shadows between the houses, swallowed by the night. Days passed, and there was no sign of her. Eventually, a moving truck appeared in front of the Kellen house, and a new family arrived, smiling, unpacking boxes, hanging curtains in the windows. They acted like the house was just a house, like it hadn't held secrets heavy enough to crush the air out of a room. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain comes and the streets are empty, I find myself looking across at that window. And in the rhythm of the drops against the glass, I swear I can still hear her voice, low and urgent, asking me the question I never answered, "You didn't see anything, right?" If this story kept you on edge, don't just let it end here. Hit that like button to show your support, subscribe for more spine-chilling true and fictional tales, and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next mystery. Share this video with a friend who loves suspense, and let me know in the comments, would you have opened the curtain or walked away?